Now, Peter Enahoro, popularly known as Peter Pan, has died in London at the age of 88. He would have to be Nigeria's and arguably Africa's most iconic journalist, an absolutely dazzling satirist whose columns in the famous Daily Times newspaper of the 50s and 60s were defined by sheer brilliance and inventiveness. Not surprisingly, in 1958, at the age of just 23, he became the editor of the Sunday Times and the feature editor of the Daily Times, then the editor in 1962 and the editor-in-chief in 1966. He would go on to become a contributing editor of Deutsche Welle Radio in Germany, the Africa editor of National Newspaper in Switzerland, and the editorial director of the New African magazine in London. But before all that, he began writing his famous Peter Pan column in 1959, a column that was at once brilliant and courageous, for which he won the admiration even of those at the receiving end of his witty satires. And those articles he wrote ended up as a best-selling book titled How to Be a Nigerian, which was filled with the idiosyncrasies, indiscretions, contradictions, and joie de vivre of the Nigerian character. Here he is, sharp as ever, speaking to Arise News from his hospital bed 2 years ago.
The name Peter Pan, incidentally, was purely accidental. I was writing 2 columns a week as editor of the Sunday Times. There was one called George Sharp, which was a political commentary. And Peter Pan was interviewing, our equivalent of stars at that time. Eventually, the management said that the George Sharp column was causing too much trouble. I should drop it. So I dropped it, and I kept the interviews. But I couldn't resist making comments in the interviews. So it evolved into Peter Pan. And over the years, it just grew and grew. Journalism has a glamour. You meet some of the highs, and you also meet some of the lows. You can be invited to lunch by President of Sierra Leone, who has his food delivered to his office every day. And he says, come and have lunch, and you're having lunch over his writing desk, and it's very glamorous. A day or two later, someone is in trouble. I won't go into too much detail. And you find yourself close to that person. And that's the low side of it. You meet the highs and you meet the lows. The cruelty of it is, at the end of the day, who is your friend? You kid yourself if you think it's only the highs. And you kid yourself if you think it's only the lows. You don't really have a permanent friend or a permanent enemy. If you do your job as you should, you find that your life rotates between the two, and it's exciting. That's what I meant.
The brilliant Peter Enahoro, who has died at the age of 88. And I should mention that in his memory, the president-elect Bola Tinubu has released a statement praising Peter Enahoro as a patriot who devoted his journalism career to the quest for a better Nigeria. And President Buhari described Peter Enahoro as a gifted and iconic journalist, author, and publisher who earned public trust through his fearless writings and his commitment to the pursuit of the truth. Well, for more insight into the life of Peter Enahoro and his enormous contributions to Nigeria's journalistic and literary landscape, I'm joined now on the line from Lagos by the diplomat, politician, journalist, academic and activist, Ambassador Dele-Cole. And here in Abuja, I'm also joined by the Jamaican poet, author, playwright and journalist Lindsay Barret. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Really very honoured to have the cream of the journalistic crop on the programme this evening. And let me come to you first, Ambassador Patrick Dele-Cole in Lagos. You could say that Peter Enahoro was one of the most venerable of African journalists who truly enriched the intellectual and cultural life of this country and the continent. What was he to you?
Peter was a friend, and the brilliance of what he did, he was coming from a historical group, because too often people tend to look down or denigrate the job of journalists. Without journalists, this country would not have been freed. And the kind of journalism which he brought, as he says in his own speech, you cannot actually be a friend of a journalist because the man is always looking for news. Nor can you have him be a permanent enemy, because really, when he has finished with you, he moves on to other things. Peter Enahoro followed the footsteps of Herbert Macaulay, Nnamdi Azikiwe. These were, in their time, thorns in the side of the British Empire and the British colonial government. And in the case of Peter, all the ministers and all the people in power were in fear about what next Peter Pan is going to bring out. And of course, if you're going to be a good journalist, you have to have a level of cynicism. And you have to know also that perhaps the people you are talking to want to use you and use your column in order to praise themselves. But where the facts are glaring, as was in his own contribution, he turned what was a visceral attack by mixing it with humor. It made a far-lasting impression. And I think Nigeria has been blessed by the kind of talents such as Peter Enahoro in the journalistic field.
Indeed, for that opening assessment of his life and his career. Let me come to you, Lindsay Barret. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. I'm going to come in a minute to talk more about that extraordinary writing style that he had, which, as Ambassador Cole said, brought people close to him, but also had them quaking in their boots. But of course, his work, Lindsay, ranged beyond his journalism, didn't it? He was something of a philosopher, in addition to being an author and a publisher. Do you recall how you first encountered him?
Well, my first encounter with him was quite humorous indeed, because Peter I had heard of before I had ever come to Nigeria. He was famous all over. And in a way, he served as a mentor, because I wanted to meet him. But I came here in July 1966 when he had already left the country, because he didn't like the idea of military rule. I became close to some members of the military. And when I did meet Peter 5 years later, he immediately attacked me for having been a part of the military government. But we became very good friends. I met him in Germany at Deutsche Welle, where I was a contributor, and he was a contributing editor. And he asked me, said, "You left Jamaica to go to Africa to join those who are going to oppress my people." And I said, no, nothing like that. I tried to explain myself. That was Peter. He was very direct. Whenever he spoke to you, he said the truth immediately. But one thing we should always remember, he belonged to an incredible historical family, the Enahoros.
Yes, I was going to come to that in a minute, because, I mean, it's quite an extraordinary political family that he belonged to, didn't he, Ambassador Dele-Cole? I mean, his eldest brother, Anthony Enahoro, was a statesman and a politician, and one of those who helped to wrest Nigeria's independence from the British.
Absolutely. Anthony Enahoro was one of the youngest ministers in the first government that started in Nigeria. But I like to situate him in the background of his family. Not only is it you have Anthony Enahoro, Peter was one of, I think, 10 siblings. And then you have Anthony, you have Henry, you have the footballer, you have the professor, you have the engineer. And his father was an inspector of schools. And it was, the ethic of behaving properly and knowing right from wrong was something that was inbred in him. He went to Government College Uweli, which has produced no end of first-class citizens. And indeed, he was a football captain in Government College Uweli, as well as his brother had been the cricket captain in King's College, Lagos. And when Peter left Government College Uweli, the person who succeeded him as captain of Government College Uweli was Sam Amuka, another scion in the journalistic world. And when Sam Amuka finished school set and came to Lagos, Peter drew him into the Sunday Times, and that was the beginning of Sam Amuka's famous Sat Sam.
What an amazing history lesson there. I mean, I'm really glad that we have people like yourself and Lindsay Barret here. And let me come to you, Lindsay, because he began writing his Peter Pan column, I think, in 1959. And he certainly ruffled feathers, didn't he? I think Ambassador Cole referred to that. He ruffled feathers among the political bigwigs in Nigeria.
Well, I'll tell you something. One of the first things I read about the Nigerians was How to Be a Nigerian in 1966, which was an anthology of the Peter Pan column. And interestingly, it gave me my first real insight into what Nigerians were. Although it was humorous, satirical, it was so accurate that you felt you knew the people he was talking about. And Peter did not write from a hostile point of view. He found humor in everything. And at the same time, he found something serious in the most frivolous of actions. He was more than a philosopher. I think he was a guide, he was a teacher.
Yeah.
And you know, he founded, of course, you mentioned that he was editorial director of the New African. But the most important thing to remember is that when Peter went out of Nigeria, he started he was one of the first people to put up a really serious African journal, Africa Now, in Europe. And some of us used to argue with him and say, why not come and do it at home? But I remember that one of the most important things about Africa Now was that you saw contributions from all over Africa. People wanted to write for Peter. People wanted to work for him.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I wish we could see the cover of that book, How to Be a Nigerian, because it really had a tremendous impact. And as Lindsay Barret was saying, Ambassador Cole, I mean, he had a tremendous sense of humor and was a really masterful satirist, and in that spirit he was able to reach a much wider audience and to advance public understanding and debate about significant issues such as democracy, ethics, and the comportment or lack of that in the Nigerian character. And as Lindsay said, and I think you mentioned earlier, that proved to be the inspiration for the classic best-selling novel How to Be a Nigerian.
That's right. It's, I guess, people who tell stories about vampire bats, you know, they suck your blood, but then they blow on the wound so that you don't wake up. It's like that. Even the second book about you have to cry in order to laugh. What he's trying to say there is that the things are so bad, the things which he was talking about were so bad that you have to find humor in order to be able to survive in this particular atmosphere. As you said, it is interesting. As I said, his father was inspector of education, and his brother went on exile for this Nigeria, and he himself in 1966 was being chased by the people who did the second coup, because they thought that he knew about the first coup. And that is why he himself ended up as an exile. But his talent was so overwhelming that, you know, that Deutsche Welle and all these European newspapers were begging for him to be their columnist. But then he combined with Ambassador Ralph Whichway in order to set up the Africa Now, which unfortunately the two major African magazines that existed then are no longer available to us. I'm talking about West Africa and Africa Now. I should hope that before long somebody else will take up that mantle and produce a magazine of the quality which Africa Now was.
Yes, absolutely. And Lindsay Barret, you said your first encounter, really, of his writings was the book How to Be a Nigerian. I wonder how much what he was addressing in that book pervaded public thinking when it was first published in 1966. Because, I mean, he was almost reflectively traumatized by the Nigerian character. And here you were, Lindsay, coming to Nigeria for the first time in 1966. I wonder if you were traumatized as well.
No, actually, I was attracted, and I was actually inspired, because I was very young, to say the least, and one of the things that I wanted to do was to understand how to interact with people. And Peter's book was almost a guide to this is what the Nigerian is. But he made the Nigerian seem not like someone you should be afraid of, but someone you should love.
Right.
And that was an important element of Peter's thought process. He always seemed to believe that Nigerians were worth being with.
So I suppose he criticized the governments, but he was with the people. And I wonder, Ambassador Cole, what you think he would have made of the Nigeria of today. I mean, if he had that same sort of vibrancy that he had in the 50s and 60s, because I mean, when he first wrote that book, How to Be a Nigerian, this country was an infinitely more livable nation, some would argue, than it is today. I mean, you know, things worked, maybe not well enough, and that justified his writing of the book. Now, imagine for us what he would make of Nigeria's today.
I'm afraid to think because things are really so bad that if he saw Nigeria today, he himself will be traumatized in trying to live in this country as at this point in time. The humor which he brought into the newspaper, you should not miss the subtext of that humor. He was really complaining. I mean, Lindsay says that, that he was asking others to love Nigeria. But he was saying that if you came to Nigeria, you have to take us with the good as well as with the bad. But even in the bad, there were points of reverence. The big change now is, I think you made the statement, that ministers used to quake in their boots as to what he was going to write. And today, the kind of almost, what's the word? Inheritance. They believe that they are entitled to take government funds and do with it how they wish, and write big budgets that have absolutely nothing to do with what's going on. Your earlier program, you are talking about poverty. You have a country that is so poor, and yet it's also one of the richest countries in the world. That kind of dichotomy would have given Peter Enahoro, if he was alive today, a great source material. And I think that really you cry because things are so lamentable. But then in the end, you have to say to yourself, well, I have to survive, so let me laugh a little. And then you tell some jokes about how bad things really are. But the jokes should never cover the depth of anguish which the various politicians in this country have led us to. I think time for the Enahoros and people like them to come back and put their searchlight on a people that were overcompensated by God, and they have delivered.
That's a good way to end the program. But just before we go, literally 10 seconds, Lindsay, Barret, what should the epitaph be to this preeminent Nigerian journalist?
He made us laugh, but he also made us think.
Thank you very much indeed. I couldn't have said it better myself. On that note, I want to thank you very much indeed, Lindsay Barret, the Jamaican poet, author, playwright and journalist, and of course Ambassador Dele-Cole, who joined us from Lagos, and he's a diplomat, politician, journalist, academic and activist. That's it for this edition of Arise Primetime. Join us again tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja and Lagos, bye-bye and thank you for watching.